Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another analysis of the BBC's hit series Sherlock 10 years too late. Apologies for not making more of these at a faster rate, as there is clearly a demand for it, but these reviews do take a considerable amount of time to produce. Book reading, movie-length episode watching and re-watching, script writing, recording, re-recording, editing, and quality control. I'm not exactly paid by the hour, so for my peace of mind and your benefit, I urge you to make a pledge on my Patreon page. This video was actually made available a week ago on Patreon for the early access crew and higher tiers. There are also exclusive reactions and reviews you won't find on YouTube, so have a gander at my Patreon page and consider supporting the content you love watching and I love making. Not everyone can make a contribution, of course, so please consider sharing this video with your friends, neighbors, loved ones, children, cats, dogs, and followers on Instagram. Now, without further ado, let's get on with the review. In my previous review, I had a little paddy about Sherlock shooting his living room walls. Upon visiting the Sherlock Holmes Museum last year, I discovered that this activity wasn't some Mark Gatiss invention, but was actually documented as happening in the Sherlock Holmes canon. During the adventure of the Musgrave ritual, Sherlock Holmes shot the letters VR into his wall. No, he wasn't predicting the future of video games. VR in the 1890s stood for Victoria Regina, the Latin name for Queen Victoria. It isn't something significant to a case being solved. In fact, the whole thing is just shrugged off as being patriotic. The point being that both book and show simply portray Sherlock Holmes as having an extreme opposition to being bored, nothing more. The episode in question today is largely based on the Sherlock Holmes story A Scandal in Bohemia, the distinction being that Belgravia is an affluent district in London and Bohemia is a historic region within the modern day Czech Republic. As we make our way through the episode, I'll be detailing what's been adapted and whether these decisions are in line with the spirit of Sherlock Holmes or were made for other reasons. For example, a cliffhanger in Sherlock Holmes is unusual to say the least. To have them end the first series in such a way was not only brave, but also, I believe, the cause of raking in over 10 million people to watch A Scandal in Belgravia on the opening night. And boy, does the ball get rolling with style. To have Moriarty, the legendary nemesis of Sherlock Holmes, be drawn away from the climax of his great game by a mysterious woman referred to as Miss Adler brings huge significance to her character from the offset. The showrunners choosing the song Stayin' Alive to play as his ringtone not only fits the protagonist's hilarious twist of fate, but seems like the kind of song this character would have as his ringtone given his perspective on people dying.
People have died.
That's what people do!
The episode then skims through a series of cases that Sherlock and John turned down or investigated. This hot seating and editing is flashy and adequately establishes how the pair fit into their roles as detective and blogger. It's interesting to note that 3 of these instances wind up being a part of the plane full of corpses we seen later on, but I've always found this connection to be kinda jammed in, as though Mycroft was watching the same footage we were.
You've been stumbling around the fringes of this one for ages, or were you too bored to notice the pattern?
They wouldn't let us see Grandad when he was dead.
She's not my real aunt. I know human Ash.
It was great seeing Sherlock reacting to John as a necessary evil as well. Not only because of his envy towards John's comparatively popular blog, but also how all the cases that keep Sherlock occupied are because of the blog now. I do appreciate the brief attempt to hone in on the theme of modern celebrity image, something that is far more significant in the 21st century than at the end of the 19th. It's comparable to Watson publishing his writings of A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of the Four in the daily press, though the focus on fame and popularity isn't something Bohemia dwells on beyond a sentence. In fact, Watson barely knew what Holmes had been up to since he married Mary at the end of The Sign of the Four. Having said this, Watson describes how Holmes has predictably changed very little since he moved out. He pops into Baker Street for a visit and basically gets roped into the mystery of the day. Holmes remarks that Watson has put on weight since wedlock, something I think the show nodded to when Molly hooked up with Moriarty in the previous episode.
And domestic bliss must suit you, Molly. You've put on 3 pounds since I last saw you. 2.5.
3.
Holmes then receives a letter written on pink paper that he deduces is from Bohemia. Watson prefaces the adventure by detailing Sherlock Holmes's attitude towards women and love in general. We learn that Irene Adler is the woman he admires above all others, with the first paragraph of the story introducing the idea that this admirable character is dead. The story kicks off with intrigue as we have the mystery of the pink letter and how Sherlock Holmes's favourite woman would wind up dead. A man wearing a mask then enters Baker Street, the pink letter's author. The man claims that the case is significant as it implicates the great house of Ormstein, the hereditary kings of Bohemia. It turns out that the king of Bohemia himself is the man behind the mask, awkward and nervous, proclaiming to have become romantically entangled with Irene Adler, a retired prima donna of the Imperial Opera of Warsaw. He not only sent letters to her with the official paper and seal, but she also has photographic evidence of the pair being together. Her lack of nobility and Bohemian heritage also makes this quite the scandal for the nobility. Worse still is that he is due to be married to a Scandinavian princess, and Adler allegedly intends to ruin him before he gets the chance to marry. Back to the show, Mrs. Hudson is seen in the flat being the housekeeper. I'm under the impression that she is here because Sherlock and John are too busy solving cases with nobody left to clean up. Either that, or she's the nosiest landlady in history. She ends up serving them breakfast later as well. Whatever happened to...
Cup of tea would be lovely, thank you.
Just this once, dear. I'm not your housekeeper.
Couple of biscuits too, if you've got them.
Not your housekeeper.
Anyway, the episode starts gearing up for a mystery involving a car backfiring and a dead athlete. Mr. Jefferson from the Impossible Planet acts as the stand-in for Lestrade this episode, who apparently set up Wi-Fi at the scene of this crime. I did like the establishment of Sherlock being such an internet sensation that he just becomes exceptionally lazy as a result. I just had trouble believing that the internet at Baker Street and at this crime scene would be so damn good that they could flawlessly stream HD footage to each other with enough detail for Sherlock to make deductions. It might not have been so bad had, say, the internet cut out, or maybe they filmed the webcam footage with actual webcams. The camera is built into the laptop, dummies! The crime gets postponed as the pair are then dragged to Buckingham Palace. This scene proves itself to be an absolute masterclass of comedy. Martin Freeman's body language and facial expressions are nothing short of perfection, and the idea that they needed Sherlock's brother to get him to put some clothes on was goddamn priceless.
Get off my sheet!
They establish that they have been dragged to the palace because of an anonymous client. Similar to how the King of Bohemia is unmasked fairly quickly in the novel, the location does all the talking about who's involved. Specifically though, the victim of blackmail in question is never revealed beyond a young woman. For the longest time, I believed it was the Queen herself that was in these compromising photographs, but it doesn't really matter as it's the family and their reputation that are at risk. It's quite hilarious considering the numerous scandals that the royal family have been known for over the years, especially in regards to the recent Prince Andrew Jeffrey Epstein shenanigans. Similar to the book's conclusion, Irene doesn't make any demands from the royalty. Her mere possession of the photographs is what's at stake. No doubt the royal family would have paid a pretty penny to prevent a photograph like this one from being published. I think the assertion that the Queen smokes as well just rounded off the comedy of this scene beautifully. It was good that the show didn't just kiss the Crown's boots and dived straight into the controversy to keep in line with the original story. It's here that Sherlock and Irene prepare to meet each other. First of all, it is Holmes who initially tails Adler in the book, unlike Irene keeping tabs on Sherlock in the show. Holmes is notorious for using disguises to do this, and it was great that they showed the pair deciding over which disguises to wear simultaneously. How John and Sherlock achieved this beaten-up vicar persona was another stroke of genius that made me howl with laughter. The whole costume montage culminating with Irene deciding not to wear anything at all was impressive to me, not just because, there's a naked lady on the screen. It firstly shows a stunning level of bravery on the part of the showrunners to have this shown pre-Watershed. It's secondly the perfect means of counteracting Sherlock's deductive powers. This woman is his kryptonite. It thirdly ties in with Sherlock wearing nothing but a bedsheet in Buckingham Palace. And finally, this is something that just wouldn't have been written in the 1890s. Not to mention Bohemia being the third Sherlock Holmes story ever published, leaving what I imagine would have been little room for risk when it came to Conan Doyle's writings at this point in his career. The show presents a nice twist on Holmes calling Adler the woman in the novel. In Belgravia, the woman is her professional pseudonym, perhaps to shrug off the outdated way Holmes initially underappreciated and trivialized women in the book. When the pair are in the taxi, Sherlock says,
The evidence was right under your nose, John, as ever.
Maybe you see but do not observe.
This is another aspect of Sherlock Holmes's deductive process that gets developed in this story. In the novel, Holmes uses a wonderful example of how many stairs there are in an occupant's house. Most people probably can't give a number off the top of their head despite walking up and down them every day. The point being that Sherlock Holmes is attuned to observing as opposed to seeing, and by extension has this uncanny ability to measure distances without ruler or tape measure. This comes into play in the episode when he puts the code, that of Irene's measurements, into her safe without being told them. I should also say that when Holmes tails Adler in the book, he disguises himself as a stableman to find out all he needs to know. A guy called Godfrey Norton, a lawyer, visits Adler daily, and it is unknown what his visits entail. When Holmes is watching the house, Norton and Adler hastily get into separate taxis and go to a church. Holmes tails them again in the same manner and spies on them from outside, only to wind up invited inside to be the witness in the marriage of Irene Adler and this Godfrey bloke. The now married couple then separate once again, with Holmes returning to Baker Street. He invites Watson on a mischievous night out with him after some dinner. Here we learn that the name of the landlady is actually Mrs. Turner? This confused me, as she was referred to as Mrs. Hudson in The Sign of the Four. I had to finally straighten this out, and the Wikipedia page says that this was the only time she was ever referred to as anything other than the landlady, the housekeeper, or Mrs. Hudson. It may have been a mistake on the part of Doyle, as apparently Mrs. Turner appeared in an early version of The Adventure of the Empty House, which would later be corrected to Mrs. Hudson. Sherlock dressing up as a clergyman basically happens in the book too, with the exception that a fight breaks out in front of Adler's house, with several men trying to gain Adler's favour by opening her carriage door for her. Oh, what times we used to live in. Holmes runs straight into the fight, applying red paint to his face at the last moment to gain sympathy from the crowd who believe that he is bleeding. Feeling sympathy, Adler has him carried into her home to rest on her sofa. Instead of John lighting up a magazine with the Queen's royal lighter, Watson throws a smoke bomb into the living room window. With Adler revealing the location of the photographs with the same logic the show adopts, it's here in the story that the two mediums diverge, because no American with silenced weapons show up from upstairs in the novel. Instead, Holmes and Watson just go home. Before the pair are about to enter Baker Street, however, a youth on the street says, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," who in turn recognizes the voice. Dun dun dun! Back to the episode, the safe is opened and a glossy slow-motion fight sequence ensues. I'm fine with it, I just think there could have been one mention of Sherlock being a boxer as well as a great detective in this series. Without it, it makes this disarmament and subsequent super smooth knockouts look rather convenient. The same goes for how he knows the weak points on the same bloke later on. This latter moment was even more annoying to me though, because this isn't exactly what I'd call deductive. Most people do know where the weak points in the human body are, yet they felt the need to put all these special effects over the top of it like Sherlock was doing something special. However, I did appreciate Sherlock's quicker than dialing 999 tactics, as well as his overconfidence when facing a dominatrix. Him being drugged, whipped, and left to face her in his delusions about the boomerang death just keeps this hype train in the episode going. And that bed coming up to meet him, the rotating camera angles, oh my god. This kind of creative cinematography and mise-en-scène is what makes Sherlock such an impressive visual masterpiece. Suddenly it was Christmas, and what a fantastically awkward party scene it was. I not only found it to be quite relatable, but these two characters were consistent in their actions. You have Sherlock not being able to stop over-analysing the situation even for a day, and Molly the hopeless romantic now made certain that her crush on Sherlock is a fool's errand. Perhaps the most important aspect of this scene above the denotations, however, is Irene Adler being in the background too. No, not literally, but...
No, that wasn't... I didn't...
It was me.
My God, really? What?
This was the perfect peak of the climax, as it throws the audience out of the emotional intensity and back into the mystery still left unresolved. I did begin to wonder though, at what point after drugging and beating Sherlock did Irene manage to record a voice clip of herself and change Sherlock's text tone? Considering that the majority of the second half of this episode is dedicated to Sherlock unlocking Irene's phone, it was quite astounding to think she unlocked his phone without issue at some point during his delirium. Or maybe he simply doesn't have a lock on his phone, leading me to believe he just has a stash of burner phones like the big fat drug addict he is. I quite like the cold, brooding atmosphere this scene in the morgue presents. It was a little odd seeing Molly here though, considering she was at Baker Street not 2 minutes beforehand. I like to think this shot of the pair smoking by the window is indicative of their lack of social skills.
Do you ever wonder if there's something wrong with us?
This aspect was represented in a straightforward manner earlier by showing both Mycroft in front of a fire groaning over the idea of Christmas phone calls, and Sherlock's interactions in his own living room. There's just something about them watching a grieving family down the corridor and being framed like this that I really like. Sherlock clearly is hiding his grief whilst having his first cigarette in a long time. Even the notion of Sherlock being an addict in recovery was nodded to, with Mycroft and John having this little phone conversation. He has to cut his plans with his new girlfriend Jeanette to bring the sullen mood back up before we all die from depression. I do really appreciate the continued flirtation with John being Sherlock's romantic partner in this adaptation too. I find that the decision not to get John married in the second episode works towards this recurring joke, but I'll cover that more when I get around to reviewing The Sign of 3 in the year 2059. The next morning, apparently it's New Year's Eve.
Any plans for New Year tonight?
I'm not sure if Moffat just needs to look at a calendar from time to time, or if this episode is just really bad at communicating how much time goes by between scenes. After seeing the most expensive shot of the entire episode, I appreciated how John was deceived into believing he was taken somewhere to see Mycroft, only to be faced with Irene. The pair are occasionally framed in a similar way to how Mycroft and Sherlock were in a previous scene, the purpose of which isn't entirely clear to me. The reveal itself is where this scene has the most impact though. First-time viewers will be just as surprised as John is at this point, but what I also appreciate is how the combined secrecy and care towards Sherlock displayed by both Mycroft and Irene contrasts wonderfully with John having a different level of care towards his best friend, the only character seemingly unwilling to treat Sherlock like a mental patient. From here, that fantastic music that was playing underneath the scene crescendos with this stunning shot of Sherlock, almost rumbling with an intense level of focus. Him solving the mystery of Irene's death and having that emotional repression shows a unique side to this character, briefly, before he sees 221 Baker Street has been broken into. The sudden shift in tone is so commendable. It's like something out of a horror movie. It's scenes like this that I do find myself appreciating Mrs. Hudson being characterized beyond just the landlady and the housekeeper, because it makes me care that she's being held hostage right here. Unfortunately, all that fear that was established on the climb up gets thrown out the window the moment this happens.
First, get rid of your boys. I dislike being outnumbered. It makes for too much stupid in the room.
And just like that, they leave.
I'm unarmed.
Mind if I check?
Oh, I insist.
Is this not how Sherlock got the upper hand last time? By distracting and then taking this bloke out in close combat? How could this idiot fall for the same trick twice? The episode then gets tangled up in one of the most confusing scenarios the show has to offer. I believe it's only to tie these rather pathetic CIA-trained Americans into the story because everything else in this episode does a great job on its own. For some reason, they felt the need to make Irene have something more important on her phone than incriminating photos of the royal family. So, what is on the phone that justifies this final act? A photograph of an email from a member of the Ministry of Defense containing seat numbers on a plane. Fair enough, Sherlock figuring out this isn't code but plane seats was commendable, and I liked the flashy reminder that Irene was working for Moriarty too. But man, I just find Mycroft getting increasingly stressed over the situation to be absolutely hilarious.
I have crippling depression.
Seeing Sherlock and Irene playing mind games with each other was really satisfying to watch. The sexual tension and near-romantic entanglement after the raspberry are really touching moments, especially with the reminder that she's basically been betraying him from the start, as well as knowing that she's just trying to keep him in one place. It's all interesting stuff. For some reason though, the Crown is just as interested in stopping this plane as Moriarty is, when the same security escort interrupts their dinner planning again and takes Sherlock to Heathrow Airport. Sherlock even spews out the exposition needed to get the audience up to speed.
There's going to be a bomb on a passenger jet. The British and American governments know about it, but rather than expose the source of their information, they're going to let it happen. The plane will blow up.
As though these two blokes give a flying fuck. Sherlock then finds the plane filled with corpses. I liked the lighting in this scene reveals a darker nature to the British Secret Service. Now that the terrorists know about the corpse flight, they'll presumably target another one instead. I have to wonder as well, mustn't this room absolutely reek of decomposing flesh right now? I did appreciate the connection between this unseen Ministry of Defense bloke and Sherlock, both eager to impress Irene. It shows Sherlock's own weakness as somebody that has difficulty socializing being tripped up by a damsel in distress. Suddenly Irene appears to make her final demands. I thought it rather hilarious that she got past the American that was out to kill her previously by going in through the back door of the plane. We then return to Mycroft's office, where the level of security on Irene's phone proves to be on a whole other level. Love winds up prevailing to Sherlock's advantage though, and he figures out the code to her phone. This reveal to me was nothing short of perfection. Irene's callous and cold-hearted act is completely unmasked here. After all the beatings he took, the idea that he would use his scientific understanding of love to unmask her was thoroughly satisfying, and the music does a fantastic job of building this moment up too. The purpose of the Christmas scene comes full circle as Sherlock once again breaks a woman's heart, all in aid of coming out as the winner of the game. Hey, I just lost the game. I think the decision to make Irene fall for Sherlock as opposed to marrying her off is an interesting one. You have her as this dominatrix bringing Britain to its knees with a single camera phone, and likewise in the novel you have the Kingdom of Bohemia facing the same fate over a set of photographs. However, I will say that my understanding of the book's ending doesn't leave much room for romance, except perhaps in one regard. We left the story with Holmes and Watson going home after identifying the location of the photographs in Adler's home. At this point, Adler, being practiced as an actress and equally interested in playing dress-up, follows the pair home to confirm she had been visited by the great Sherlock Holmes. She was the one who bid him goodnight on the street. The next morning, the pair go back to Adler's residence, accompanied by the King of Bohemia, and find Adler and her new husband have fled the country, taking the photographs with her. She leaves a letter to Holmes in the place where the photographs were hidden, claiming she had been previously warned about Sherlock Holmes. This unnamed cautionary individual, like the accomplice in A Study in Scarlet, is never named in the story. Adler continues to write that the king can do what he will without hindrance, and the only other thing left with the letter is a photograph of Adler alone in an evening dress, which Holmes claims as payment for solving the king's problem. According to Watson, this apparently causes Holmes not to make merry over the cleverness of women from then on, which is quite satisfying knowing that his rather unsavory remarks about women from earlier are being wiped off the slate and seem to promise a change of character for the better. Him being outwitted by a woman doesn't leave him bitter or even bigoted, but instead resorts to simply accept his loss and hold women in a higher regard from then on. It's a struggle to try and determine whether Holmes kept the photograph out of sentimentality or respect. This dilemma to me makes A Scandal in Bohemia end wonderfully. Of course, sentimentality is precisely what gives Sherlock the victory blow in the episode, making him a colder character than his book counterpart. The final moments of this episode with him saving Irene change the tide somewhat. The delivery of the final lines seem to adjust Sherlock's attitude towards her as being more respectful. Irene herself said she's all about trouble above anything else, but even then I'm wondering if this was just part of the mask she put on in her attempt to beat Sherlock. My main gripe about the ending though is that I just don't see how Sherlock could rescue Irene without the aid of, say, his brother and the British military or something. Instead, we briefly see him waving his sword around against several armed men with fingers on triggers. On the other hand, I am willing to entertain that this is some kind of fantasy he conjures up for the possible reasoning behind her final text to him, confirming that he too loves her. I mean, just look at that cute little smile on his face. So, did it suck? Nah. Out of the episodes I've reviewed thus far, this has to be the strongest. This deep focus on Sherlock and his relationship with Irene Adler is so detailed and interesting. To see them romantic in their own way creates a battle of cunning that rivals Moriarty. even if he was part of the whole thing from the start. The high-quality filmic composition of this episode is astounding, the glorious score and side-splitting comedy shine through as always. It probably could have done without Moffat's obsession with Wi-Fi and the Americans with their vague purpose. Maybe the third act could have been cleared up a bit without getting too big for its boots. Otherwise, this is a stylistically fantastic, character-driven story with twists and turns to make one amazed. I give A Scandal in Belgravia an 8 out of 10. Hello, bottle of water, we meet again. This was the perfect peak of the climax as it throws the audience out of the intense emotional intensity. That's a great sentence, Harry, well done. La 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 la. When Holmes is watching them, Norton and Adler then hastily get